chapter 2 of the book that we've been reading for the last week, which has sections on kind of at a high level about encryption, digital signatures, PKI, collision attacks, common sort of notions of security for encryption schemes, and a couple of other things. And we're also going to talk about the importance of not thinking that you are an expert at cryptography after 4 months, which is kind of like maybe obvious, and it might even be a little bit condescending, but there is something of a history of would-be secure algorithms that would take more than the processors that there are atoms in the universe to break, and then accidentally turning them something into that you could break with 15 seconds in a script, right? So we're going to talk about that a little bit. And a good place to sort of post questions. I should be able to react to anything that you post in either, let me just make sure that I can see the YouTube chat. Looks like, oh man, when I type it's going to make a lot of noise. Test. So I've just typed a test into the YouTube chat to see if you can all see that. So we'll see.
I can see it as well. So
cool. Yeah, and you should all be able to hear Chloe as well. So we're going to see if that is actually true, probably in about an hour when we end up posting this. Neat. I got reactions. Killer. So yeah. Welcome everyone back to week 2. Thanks for putting up with a little bit of technical difficulties, and thank you, James, for telling me that you can hear Chloe. So this week we're going to talk about chapter 2, like I said, but before we do that, I want to suggest a couple of notions about how to make worst use of the lecture. Now I'm going to post a little thing in the main channel on how to make the worst use of lectures. So lectures are kind of not the best format for learning for a lot of things. They tend to be non-interactive, especially if the host doesn't actually make a concerted effort to make them interactive. It's really easy to zone out in the middle of a sort of like long natter spree. And so like and also just generally you want multiple passes of the same content before you really, I think, have sort of some notion of like understanding. Like anything particularly hard usually takes several repeated passes before you really understand it at any significant level, right? And so a lecture can be one of those passes, but it's really like the only pass that you want. But I want to address like a couple of ways that we can make lectures a little bit worse, right? And so there's like a couple of things that I think you might try as strategies if you wanted to reduce the effectiveness of this lecture at actually like learning cryptography. And like one of the best things that you can do for a lecture is just show up and then not ask questions at all. And it turns out that this is really useful because like you not only feel like you showed up for the lecture and might have learned something, but you also like have the impression to anyone else who might be there that like they can also show up and just like hang out. And like coexist around like a vibe of learning. And this is actually very powerful for like not learning anything. So best ways to deal with a lecture are to that you're trying to not learn anything from is to just show up every time and kind of resent that you have to show up every time because you've been showing up for the last several weeks, and then do nothing during the entire lecture. Like don't ask questions, don't come to the lecture with prepared thoughts, don't do any of that. And if you're like really going in like on this sort of like make it worse, like do other things while you're doing the lecture. And not like sort of things that you can be kind of meditative while still focused on the lecture, like going for a walk and like seeing the sun today. Do stuff like read other books, or particularly the book that we're reading for the course. There's lots of ways that you can sort of undermine this sort of capacity for learning in a lecture. And so like if you actually did prepare for the lecture by doing the reading or the exercises, do definitely wait until the lecture to ask any and all questions. Because like it turns out that if you wait several days to ask your questions, sometimes they just go away, right? Because either they got answered or just as often because you forgot them. And basically, that's also really useful for everyone else who's at your lecture or who comes to the lecture, because they might have had the same question but also forgot. So both of you can like sort of additively forget everything. And like, maybe you asked a different question for the lecture. Didn't really sort of cover the thing that came up while you were actually studying. So those are two pretty good strategies for like not making the most of lectures. And I think we've kind of like maybe hit the sort of like hit the nail on the head with the first two. But the third is like really, I think, the way to drive the point home. If you really want to maximize like your sensory perception of like learning, you should come to lectures and absorb only intensely the essence of cryptography. The secret essence of learning is actually just maximizing all of your sensory inputs with like cryptography content, like a hit interval section. So those are like some pieces of advice that you might come into this lecture with, like take the least possible out of it. And if you'd like to actually not follow any of that advice, I think that would be probably a better strategy. But I think that these are things that we've probably all done at one point or another. So I thought it would be kind of a fun, sardonic experiment of giving you bad advice and seeing if you might already be accidentally following it. So if you are following any of these pieces of advice, it's probably not the worst idea to consider whether or not you want to continue doing those things. But I obviously don't know what you're doing and how you want to structure your time, what you think the best use of your time is. But I might suggest, if at all possible, not doing these things during the lecture and structuring the sort of time that you spend on this project to make the most use of it. So without further ado, we are going to switch over to, I think, review. We're going to switch over to reviewing the homework from last week. So let's find that. So this is the one here. So yeah.
Okay. And RV's point there, where you're having difficulties, putting your questions here in the main study group channel is great. Potentially, though, if you have questions we can answer right away. You can also use, that's a great spot for it, because we could also have upvotes as well. So if any questions you have, please feel free to put them in the Discord if you want actual like interaction with them. We can do like discussion as well on the YouTube.
Yeah, good points. So it's going away. Fun. I'm going to break everything with stream on. Okay, so yeah, I think I'm going to leave this over here while we cover the solutions. Yeah. Yeah, all right. So without further ado, I hope the homework was interesting and slightly challenging, but not exceedingly challenging for everyone. Of course, if you don't have a lot of experience with writing Rust or doing other sorts of cryptography related stuff, there are a couple of ways that this could be more challenging potentially for you, but this should have been a reasonably easy homework set. A lot of it was sort of targeting your ability to actually go out and do, I think, what is actually one of the most useful things, which is sort of figure out where your gap in learning is. And how to go address it with a search, right? So a lot of this stuff, I think, for this homework should sort of challenge you to ask questions, and these are sort of meta questions about, I'm struggling with X, how do I solve my own problem in a way that makes sense, and how do I use search and other people to sort of make the best use of sort of the available resources. So the first question was about the security of a system, and all of these solutions are public on the website. I did pull a bit of a bait and switch this week, where I moved all of the course-related content to this folder on the Uncloak website. And it was previously on HackMD. I think the syllabus is still on HackMD and will remain on HackMD. But I think we're going to be switching to posting all site content to the Uncloak website for sort of simplicity's sake. Having all site content in one place is nice. Also, we get this fun little graph on the side. Massive stan for graphs. Love my graphs.
Also, someone is asking if we could please increase the font size
Thank you.
of the site. Yes.
Let's do that. That seems to make plenty of sense. Yeah. So the first question was about improving the security of a system. And the main sort of improving the security of a system being a trade-off against other kinds of security. And I think this is more of a general security question than a cryptography question in particular. A lot of the time, there's sort of trade-offs between security and performance or security and features, like the first chapter kind of covers. And so this is more or less just a general question about thinking in a secure mindset, like how could something go wrong? And I think a sort of recent example that came to mind was that a couple of months ago, at the end of 5 years of this algorithm passing several years of standardized review, being a major candidate for the post-quantum cryptography algorithm standards. It took 5 years for this algorithm to be in a fairly public position before it was totally and thoroughly broken. And so the moral here, I think, is that you can try to anticipate your security needs, or you can say this algorithm provides an entirely new primitive to sort of do something entirely new. For the last year, I've been working on a threshold signature protocol, right? And this threshold signature protocol is from 2018. So kind of a similar situation, using fairly recent cryptography, something less than 5 years old, to do something that basically wouldn't have been possible before. But there's always a risk in using kind of newer cryptographic algorithms. And this is not the only way that you could potentially sort of undermine your own security by using new algorithms. There's sort of the context of you're using non-standard algorithms as opposed to standard algorithms. You're using, because the non-standard algorithms are more performant. I gave an example of that later, actually, where we're talking about a TLS implementation that's implemented in F***. And F* is one of these sort of newer languages that has natural baked-in sort of formal verification techniques baked in for the language. So the produced binary can be very provably sort of correct, which is sort of a similar thing to Rust, provable borrow semantics. But other language, the F* language sort of main claim to significance is that you can do this entire sort of compiling down from the F* language into an efficient binary. So there's sort of some overlap there with the claims that Rust makes about the sort of move semantics of the language, meaning that you can do things like fearless concurrency without fear of sort of memory errors. The sort of premise here being that security and efficiency are often at a trade-off. Security and sort of the availability of a new algorithm are sometimes at a trade-off. And just generally, as a cryptography person, you need to always be sort of conscious of the trade-offs that you might be making when trying new algorithms or non-standard algorithms or algorithms that are not formally verified or whatever else. And especially as I think most of you are kind of coming from cryptocurrency world, the importance of audits maybe is also something that sort of might resonate with a lot of you. So moving on to the second batch of questions. Considering a group of 30 people who wish to establish pairwise secure communications using symmetric key cryptography, this is a sort of sample test your mathematical ability problem. This is basically something that everyone should feel reasonably comfortable with. This is sort of a basic math question for this level of group. And if you didn't immediately recognize that this was a sort of triangle number or a handshake lemma or whatever else, That may be a sign that you will want to brush up a little bit on your mathematics here, because this is a sort of like basic, common reoccurring question in any sort of like computer science field. And cryptography is a sort of child of computer science, and also perhaps even more so of mathematics. Next question here. Suppose Bob receives a message signed using a digital signature scheme with Alice's signing key. Does it prove Alice saw the message and chose to sign? No. Alice may have had a compromised computer. So this is sort of like a, it's a fairly trivially obvious question. That, like, of course, Alice did not necessarily see every message that her computer did, and Alice could have been compromised. Moving on. Supposing that a chosen ciphertext attacker cannot recover the secret decryption key for an encryption scheme, does this mean the encryption scheme is secure? So this question is basically targeting how can we break a encryption scheme, even if we have a chosen ciphertext attack where the attacker can't actually recover the key. Well, it turns out that there are plenty of examples in the real world where the chosen ciphertext attacker may not be able to recover the key, but may have enough data to basically say, well, I can correlate this message with some other messages, and the encryption scheme basically doesn't follow the sort of property that the algorithm is robust to like correlations or whatever else. So for like a pretty common example of this, you can see the AES and ECB mode. You can literally see a penguin on the output of the AES algorithm in ECB mode on ciphertext or on plaintext, where the plaintext in that particular instance is like a picture of a penguin. So in summary, you basically don't have a guarantee that just because the attacker can't steal your key doesn't mean that your encryption scheme is actually valid. So considering a symmetric key crypto system in which the cryptographic keys are randomly selected from the set of all n-bit strings, approximately what should n be to provide 128 bits of security against a birthday attack? So this is basically something that should always be in your head, that collision attacks are often possible in cryptography. And it's not like they are always possible, but they are often possible and sort of pernicious in a bunch of different ways. So the general sort of model for conservatism is that if you ever want to have X bits of security, in this case 128 bits of security, unless you can prove that there is no collision attack against your thing, you're probably going to end up with twice as many bits in your key size. So in this case, we want 128 bits of security against a birthday attack, so we double that to get 256-bit keys. And this should make sense, because if I build up a table of 128, 2 to the 128 values, which, by the way, that would be very hard. Harder than, very hard, as in impossible. If I built up a table of 2 to the 128 values, then any particular attack any particular evaluation of the symmetric key crypto system would have a 1 over 2 to the 256 times 2 to the 128 probability. So like a total of 1 over 2 to the 128 chance of colliding with something that I already had on my table, which would mean that I had roughly, I would have to wait until I got a collision, and this ramble has not exactly been my clearest, but you get the idea, hopefully. So then moving on to a couple of general questions that I wrote for this section. This is generally directed at finding your resources, looking for stuff in the right direction, in particular in the sort of like Rust world. And I wanted to draw attention particularly to a couple of libraries that are probably going to be recurringly useful to you if you want to write cryptography in Rust. Each of these libraries are sort of like well-known cryptography libraries in the sort of like Rust ecosystem. They're not the only well-known Rust cryptography libraries, but they should be sort of like your first stops on the like, I want to use cryptography in Rust. These are some pretty well-known cryptography libraries, and basically like you probably won't be making a wrong first move. You just check out these 5 places at least, and they implement fairly standard stuff. Like TLS is basically like the modern Rust, or sorry, the modern sort of package of cryptography that pretty much everyone uses on the internet. Stuff like key exchange, MACs, hashing, symmetric crypto, some asymmetric crypto. Like all of this stuff is usually in a TLS sort of implementation. So yeah. And I think I brought up the, oh goodness me, it looks like, okay, there's a typo there. The F-star language, I brought up the F-star language in the sort of comment on this, in that the F-star language is this language that I mentioned earlier in the stream. It's this formally verifiable type system. So there's like a security trade-off here between would you like your implementation to be easy to write, in which case you might write it in a language like Rust or something equivalent. But if you'd like to sort of have a maximally formally verifiable implementation, you might instead opt to use something like the F# language, which is designed specifically for these like highly valuable sort of must not have bugs kind of implementations. So like a lot of the time, like we'll see like basically like a Rust implementation or some like other higher level language implementations of cryptography libraries. And if the cryptography library is particularly widely used, like TLS or the Linux kernel's sort of cryptography suite, sometimes it will get rewritten in like one of these formal verifiable languages like F*. So yeah, moving on here. So there's only a couple more here. Benchmarking the speed of an algorithm is something that you basically should always be doing. Benchmarking is sort of like, I think, generally underemphasized. In the importance of benchmarking basically is like your sanity check on whether or not your implementation of an algorithm actually improved it or did not improve it. When you're trying to do something, benchmarking the speed of an algorithm is basically like your sort of ground truth on like whether or not you did a good thing. But it's also in cryptography sort of like, this is sort of second comment. If you wanted to attack an algorithm, particularly common attack is a timing attack. And a timing attack says that we're going to do some differential analysis on the time to encrypt and decrypt these two different plain texts, right? And so we're going to, I think, in the coming weeks, revisit how we might construct a timing attack on some of our Vigneri ciphers. I deprecated this question. I had originally thought that there was a tweakable encryption scheme standard, and there really isn't. So the basic sort of like premise of tweakable encryption, which is often used for disk encryption, is that you would like to encrypt something in place. And the sort of premise for encrypting something in place is that you would probably like to do that with a sort of like key that is somewhat predictable, but you would like to sort of like tweak the like encryption algorithm for all of the disks as it's sort of like this point is not the same as that point is not the same as that point, which is sort of like the way you get around like the AES, the AES ECB sort of like penguin problem that I described earlier. So tweakable encryption is particularly efficient for data that's not going to move anywhere, but is not particularly good for data that might move through a message passing channel, so it's efficient, but it's not necessarily something that you'd want to use for message passing. So I wasn't actually able to find a standard for AES XTS, which was sort of surprising to me, because I had assumed that since it's used often for disk encryption, like there probably would be a standard, but there apparently is not, except for the ISO standard, which is behind a paywall, which this apparently happens sometimes. There is a standard behind a paywall. Ooh, we got our first spam. We got free virtual girls chat in our spam in our YouTube. So that's fun. How do I ban this? Yeah. I don't see that there is a way. Chloe, would you try to ban that? Now, moving on to... So yeah, last two or three. So basically the last three questions are kind of, or the last three questions, two of them are sort of like high level questions on how to approach a problem. So you want to understand a new paper on a polynomial commitment scheme. You've been trying for more than an hour and the math is over your head. Usually, and this happens all the time, like problem is kind of over your head. Mathematical problems are often poorly expressed. The authors didn't write the paper to be read, especially not by sort of like practitioners, maybe by other sort of like researchers. This happens kind of a lot, right? And the whole premise, I think, is the way to approach a mathematical problem is often sort of, you might tackle it head on, but it might also not be that important that you understand the mathematical details. Usually you can ask for help in sort of like a question that like you have to answer. Like you can probably find help. You might even be able to email the author if it's particularly important. But I also want to emphasize that like the importance of like a community, like the one that you're currently participating in, is that you can take advantage of it. You can ask for help in the Uncloak channels, or if you're participating in the ZK Hack Discord server, like a polynomial commitment scheme is exactly the kind of thing that you might be able to ask for help in the sort of ZK Hack channels. The ZK Hack Discord server is another excellent project. They have an ongoing sort of like capture the flag set of exercises and zero knowledge stuff. So shout out to them. But I just want to emphasize that like asking for help is sort of like one of the most useful skills that you can develop, and it sort of gets in the, I think the sort of thing to emphasize really is like, don't panic. Math is hard, cryptography is hard, but being able to sort of like ask for help is really important. I'm going to skip this one for a second. What's a side channel attack? A side channel attack is a lot of things. There are lots of ways for side channel attacks to be implemented, but basically any way that your cryptography implementation might differ or leak information about the thing that you are working on, the data that you're working with, whether that is timing sort of issues where like maybe one plain text encrypts faster than another plain text, whether that is if a lot of cryptography is implemented in hardware, some is implemented in software, any sort of like power analysis that can be done over the processor or integrated circuits is a side channel attack. In this particular instance, I implemented the binary cipher without putting any attention to protecting key information. And a common sort of like new person in cryptography mistake is that your key information is often left out in the open, basically in your RAM, or sometimes even in your sort of like saved memory. So when you write an implementation, a cryptography implementation, you usually want to use a special library to handle your secret information, like secrecy or zero-wise. Zero-wise is, or secrecy is like a higher level version of zero-wise. They work well together. And they are by the Rust crypto authors, by the way. But the way to use basically like these libraries is so that you don't leak your key information, so that like maybe the attacker like just runs your algorithm with your key, and then like takes a snapshot of your RAM, and bam, they have your key now, which is fun times. And there, I think, is one last bit. So like your implementations of the Vigneri cipher, I don't think we're actually going to go over today. But I think I'm going to post a thread after the chat where everyone can post their implementations of Vigneri, and we can sort of like have a collection of Vigneri implementations, and we can sort of talk about some of their differences. So I'll get back to that in a bit. And then the last bit here is the paper New Directions in Cryptography. And the reason I assigned this paper for the first week, and it's totally all right if you like skimmed the paper, didn't read the entire paper, whatever. The whole bit with New Directions in Cryptography is that it basically kicks off like the entire modern sort of field of cryptography for like the 1970s and thereafter are basically like forever kind of like, before this paper, there's symmetric key cryptosystems, which symmetric key cryptosystems are already somewhat powerful in that they allow two participants to communicate over an insecure channel, but only if the two participants already know each other. So this paper basically introduces like an entirely new set of primitives that sort of rely on asymmetric key cryptography and kind of kicks off the sort of like whole, I think, revolution of cryptography being like actually a powerful tool for people who don't already have sort of a lot of power to like do like key distribution, like governments and banks and whatever. This paper is sort of like the revolution of cryptography for, I think, like the most people. Like after this, like the sort of like the reason asymmetric key cryptography is like so powerful is like you don't need to be a government to distribute keys. You can just be two people that sort of like communicate over the internet or whatever. And they introduced the premise of digital signatures, which they call broadcast signatures. They introduced the Diffie-Hellman assumption, which is like something that I can't go a week, sometimes even a day, without hearing the Diffie-Hellman assumption or some flavor of the Diffie-Hellman assumption. So this paper is really like kind of the, I think, root paper of like a lot of the things that basically happen over the next 50 years in cryptography since 1976. And I won't say it's like entirely easy reading, and all of the editions of the paper that I could find are a little bit hard to read, in that they were maybe not perfectly scanned. But I think the paper is sort of like, it speaks for itself for a lot of reasons. So having burned through, oh wow, I probably need to get faster at reading the solutions. We're probably going to go until about probably another 30 minutes here. I think maybe now would be a good time to check in. I'm looking for questions in the chat about this week's reading. So I see that
So it seems like one of the main questions was RV was saying they had some difficulty understanding the difference between a known plaintext model and a chosen plaintext model. There was some discussion there about that in the forum. And aside from that, it seemed like there was just more general discussion. So yeah.
All right, cool. So let's wander back over here. Yeah, so like I suppose the discussion about the ciphertext only attack probably already happened, but I guess it's worth going over just really quickly. There are maybe like four main ways that we sort of like look at encryption models. And there are extensions to these sort of like four main ways. The models are increasingly strong, and so like maybe one thing worth emphasizing is that the way that cryptographers look at the security of an algorithm is like how strong can the attacker be, and we can still prove that the model is resistant to attack in whatever that means. So the weakest attacker would be a ciphertext only model where the attacker only gets access to the encrypted messages. So like Eve just watches messages pass by. A slightly stronger model would be that the attacker maybe captured a base, and the base had like a couple of like plain text ciphertext pairs around. And and like this is sort of like a military model where like, you know, maybe the enemy captured like one of your troops, and the troops had like a couple of like decrypted ciphertexts. So now you have like a couple of like maybe like randomly selected like plain text ciphertext pairs. So if you could use that to find the key, this is something that you could use, for instance, with a one-time pad. A one-time pad is called a one-time pad because after you've used it one time, you can never use it again, because it only takes one time of using a one-time pad before you can sort of find the key from that application. So a known plain text attack is like a slightly more powerful attack than a ciphertext only attack. Then you have your chosen plain text model, which is again a slight boost on the you got your known plain text model, where like you don't get to choose which plain texts you get to decrypt. But if you get to choose which plain texts the adversary would like to decrypt, like for instance, if the adversary gets to say, I want you to encrypt this plain text for me, and so that I can see what several plain text ciphertext pairs would look like. Like for instance, suppose that you had a service that said, I will encrypt this thing for you and then send it on to like some private server. And I will show you what the ciphertext looks like. Well, maybe basically like in this model of computer services, sometimes services need to do things for people, like encrypt stuff. So chosen plain text attacks might also just be relevant in that like an attacker should be able to say, I want to see this thing be encrypted, and I don't necessarily get to know what the key is, but if I can, decipher what the key is because I own the sort of machine or whatever. Like for instance, like the attacker owns your machine and is trying to pull out the key from the machine. This actually happened in, I think, the Sony PlayStation 3. There was a sort of instance of that where Sony did not shuffle keys across like different PlayStation 3s. And so it turns out that their encryption algorithm was vulnerable to a chosen plain text attack, and hardware engineers were able to extract the Sony PlayStation 3 private key, which is kind of a fun sort of historical anecdote. And then the chosen ciphertext model is like the most powerful of the four models. We can even sort of like, it was a reused nonce. Yeah, thanks, Matt. Matthew Doughty said in the chat that they reused their nonce with the Sony PlayStation 3. And then the chosen ciphertext model is the most powerful of the four, where the attacker can encrypt and decrypt any plain text or ciphertext that they would like, which is somewhat counterintuitive. But the reason that makes sense is that if the attacker still can't actually pull the private key out of the encryption system, even given the ability to encrypt and decrypt as much as they would like, then the key is about as secure as it could be. It's not necessarily the case, as we discussed in the homework, that the attacker couldn't actually infer information about the relatedness of the plain texts, even if the key is secure. But at least in the chosen ciphertext model, this is about as strong as we can get at making the key entirely secure. So yeah, I'm looking at more. I don't see any other questions right away. So I think we're going to switch.
One question that just got asked. It was asked a little bit in the YouTube chat, and then it was just deposited into the forum about the birthday math in general. So yeah, just about chapter 2, question 7, and how it works to get like the 128 bits of security.
Yeah. How the birthday math makes okay. About 128 bits of security. Let's take a small case as a sort of example. Okay, how do I want to come up with? I think what we do here is this. Okay. So let's take So taking a small case here. So suppose that there's like 8. Oh gosh, there are 8 possible values for a hash function to output, or a encryption function to output, whatever. That's like 7. Then if I want to find a collision between, we're just going to say a hash function for this case, but it could equally be an encryption system. If I want to find a collision between, let's say these are the inputs, or no, these are the outputs, yeah. Oh gosh, it's been a while since I've used this tool. So these are the outputs. The thing that we want for our hash functions is we want them to be collision resistant. We want this also to be true for encryption functions. But since hash functions take an arbitrary length input and produce some fixed length output, the sort of collision resistance of a hash function is very important. So the intuition between like a birthday attack is that if the first hash function output lands in this slot, and the second hash function output lands in this slot, though it had a 1 out of 8 chance of collision, then the third hash function, this is a beautiful too, by the way, then the third hash function will land in a non-overlapping slot with probability 2 over 8. And there's a way to express this sort of question as like, when would we expect there to be a collision on average for the hash functions to sort of output a collision? And frankly, like my attempt at whiteboarding this has been mostly a flop, in that like I can barely read what I myself have written. But the intended sort of like outcome of this sort of like thought experiment is we could do some math on when we would expect a collision to occur, and the resulting answer of that turns out to be about square root of n. So the square root of 8, for instance, is about 2.8. So we would expect after like roughly 3 instances of choosing a random value where the output could only take on 8 values, we would expect that to occur roughly 2 to 3 times, every 2 to 3 hash functions. Now, scaling that up to like 128-bit security, if we wanted a hash function with 128-bit security against like collisions, well, we would need to take the square root of the actual outputs of that hash function. So the hash function would have to take 128 bits squared. And so that's 2 to the 128 to the power of 2. So we would actually want 2 to the 256 bits. And if that helped at all, I'm hopeful that helped at all. Yep. Okay. Maybe wondering.
Yeah, that's a pretty good explanation, and someone was pointing out that in the book it does explain that like this is an approximation, and that like cryptographers use this approximation to make it simpler to understand like the security bounds. And then obviously there is ways to like look into the actual math of it if people would like to, and it gets a lot more complex than the approximation. But yeah.
Yep. Yeah. So looks like we probably have about another 15 minutes of class here. So I think what I'm going to do here is we haven't gotten that many questions this week, and frankly the reading this week was pretty light. We haven't yet talked about the second part of the reading, which was involving experts. So I would encourage you to ask any questions before or while I start nattering about involving experts. But the basic sort of like takeaway of the second chapter of reading, which is chapter 23 this week, is that cryptography kind of has this, and this is something that I think is like particularly like relevant, because I think that there's like a way to take this advice too seriously. like involving experts is not necessarily bad advice, but I think it also feeds into something that I think is actually quite bad in the cryptographic community, which is this premise of like, don't roll your own crypto. And don't roll your own crypto means, I think, a lot of things, but as sort of taken literally, it means that if you design your own crypto system, then you're kind of taking risks with what is an incredibly difficult field, and this is absolutely true. But I think that the sort of advice of don't roll your own crypto kind of has rolled over into only experts can do anything related to cryptography. Only experts can design cryptography, only experts can implement cryptography, and only experts should be even allowed to sort of like talk about cryptography, because like cryptography is just too complicated for the, developer or like high level sort of like product person or whatever. And I think that's sort of like not what may have been intended by the particular advice of sort of like the don't roll your own crypto kind of thing. And cryptography is like legitimately very complicated. It requires a sort of like reasonable level of development and mathematical sophistication to be like sort of working at a sort of competent level in. But I think that all of the sort of things that I just mentioned like are like a little bit, I don't like them. In that like I think most of the people that I know are very much self-taught developers in cryptography, like the sort of like entire sort of set of people that I tend to hang out with and talk about cryptography with. Very few of them went to school for this sort of thing. So I think that like this kind of don't roll your own crypto attitude has been kind of unhelpful for a lot of people that have been in my position and positions of people that I know, in that we sort of like we taught ourselves cryptography, and there just weren't like good enough resources because everyone just assumed that cryptography was only for experts. Well, we kind of became like pseudo experts ourselves, and that like we taught ourselves stuff. But closing that matter out, the involving experts chapter is legitimately good advice. If you do a 4-month study group on cryptography, you really are not an expert. If you do an 8-month sort of training in cryptography, you probably still aren't an expert. If you do a year training in cryptography, even with like a pretty serious like mathematical background and like a reasonable sort of like computer science sort of like training, you might know a couple of things, but you're still not an expert, right? So like the people who go to school for like anywhere between like 2 to 5 years for a PhD in like cryptography, they frankly don't feel like experts. And I think like the whole thing here is that like cryptography is really hard. And the thing that I think that I take out of this chapter is that because cryptography is really hard, I think the advice of involving experts is the take that the authors have. But the take that I have is that like involving other people, people who may not know everything but may know a couple of things, is just important. And this is sort of like maybe also the spirit of the study group, is that learning things is hard. Cryptography is not the only hard thing. Learning things is also hard. And so involving, I think, finding ways to involve other people in your sort of learning efforts, and involving other people in your implementation efforts, and involving other people in your, if you would like to design cryptography, in your designing efforts, at every stage of this stack, I think of this chapter as less of a experts are important and more of a, it's really important to think about how you can sort of communicate and collaborate with other people to have the best result yourself. And I admittedly am not actually that good at this, because I think that when I was in school, I was really quite passionate about cryptography, but I didn't see very many cryptography people around me. So I spent a lot of time studying cryptography basically by myself. This study group is largely an effort to sort of allow you to study cryptography with other people. So this whole sort of effort, I think, is largely informed by this premise that being able to involve others is actually like potentially very valuable. And sort of the way you take the most advantage of that is like asking this question of like, how do I provide value for other people who might be struggling with the topic? And how do I ask my questions such that other people can help me? So then returning to the chapter gives like several examples of like people going out into the world and working with cryptography, but not really understanding it. And this is sort of like, maybe demonstrative that cryptography is like kind of complicated and kind of hard. And this is also just generally true of, I think, like technical topics. Like, I should make this bigger so that y'all can see it. So yeah, cryptography is kind of hard because it's sort of like this bastard child of like computer science and mathematics, neither of which are known to be particularly easy fields in the first place. And he gives the example of WEP, the original 802.11 wireless standard, which had broken encryption. And a way to have fixed that would have been perhaps I think it was the IETF who designed WEP. I could be wrong about that. The way to have fixed that would have been that basically it sounds like the IETF engineers didn't actually consult cryptographers at the time. And it might have been difficult to consult cryptographers at the time based on the availability of cryptography expertise. Like the 90s were, I think, maybe cryptography as a sort of asymmetric cryptography field is like 20 years old. That usually means that there's probably not a whole lot of experts. But Bruce is absolutely on the money here that like when designing complicated systems, like designing by committee is dangerous. And he sort of outlines that in 2022 because chapter 22. Because like designing by committee means that like everyone has a requirement and no one kind of gets exactly a good thing. But also when designing for security, there are lots of different perspectives that I think matter when trying to figure out like what actually constitutes the right kind of design for this particular problem. What is the secure way to approach the problem? And there's some chat going on about the cryptography exports being illegal in the 90s. There's a really interesting history there. I don't think we'll get to it today. We might get to it in the future. But the United States government had a long sort of like history of being a direct adversary of cryptography communication from basically the 70s until the 90s. Like exporting cryptography stronger than a certain bit strength, where I think the bit strength was like 40 bits, which is ridiculous. Which, by the way, we'll get to in this week's extra reading. There's a cryptanalysis of the digital encryption standard for this week's sort of extra reading. But anyway, the 90s had interesting ramifications for like the political status of crypto, where like basically bringing a cryptography algorithm outside of the United States was constituted a felony under U.S. law. So yeah, the main thing to take out of this chapter is really like hard things hard. This true. We know that hard things hard, and a good way to sort of like build your set of meta skills is by sort of understanding how to approach the general problem of hard things are hard with knowing how to ask for help. And this study group is like one way that you can actually practice that skill, asking for help. But another way that you can practice that skill is sort of like going out into the world and sort of like trying to help other people understand maybe some things that they do not currently understand. And this is why I think like the study group sort of like subgroups and the study group main channel and the share resources and the Rust and the cryptography threads and the study group, all of these are your tools. They're your tools for discussion. And one of the most valuable things that you might be able to get out of this course might be getting help yourself, but it could also be helping others. So that's, I think, what I really wanted to emphasize with this chapter. And so I think we're kind of heading into the last 10 minutes of this stream. So I think we're going to take a moment to just peek ahead at chapter 3 and 4. In the next chapters, we're going to be talking about block ciphers. Chapter 2 is kind of a high-level introduction to basically a lot of different elements from cryptography, whether that's encryption, authentication, double key stuff, digital signatures, PKIs, just kind of a high-level bird's eye view of a lot of different sort of things in cryptography. Part 2 and chapters 3 and 4 are basically the symmetric key primitives of block ciphers and block cipher modes. And we're going to kind of take this at a pretty fast clip in that block ciphers are important. and you probably will use them, but they probably won't be the most interesting thing out of this whole course. I think that block ciphers are basically going to be informative when we talk about hash functions and how we talk about message authentication codes and all of the other stuff. But I think that the stuff that is going to be really kind of important for you to take out of this next two sections is going to be basically here is an appreciation for like some of the techniques that have been employed in the sort of like creation of the most efficient block ciphers, and maybe also a particular appreciation for a lot of very standard crypto is like designed specifically so that it's easy to implement in hardware. And although this book doesn't precisely cover like the sort of like exactly what it means for something to be implemented in hardware, like keep in mind like the operations in block ciphers tend to be like fairly simple stuff, the kind of stuff that you could like implement with like a transition with like an integrated circuit that basically is designed to permute bits or whatever. So that's something that I wanted to point out. And then just taking a slight look ahead to the homework for this week. This week's homework is going to be a little bit more on the side of this week's homework is going to be a little bit more on the side of implementation exercises. We're going to do lots of examples of basically doing using software to take a look at the here we go. I think this is it. Using software to actually Anondev, I'm going to post it in a second, and I'm actually trying to find that myself actually right now, which is fun. Yeah, okay, I'll post it in a second. Now seems like the wrong time to spend too much time wandering around looking for the homework that I just wrote, or that Chloe mostly just wrote.
Post it in the channel then.
Oh, you posted it in the channel? Cool. Yeah. So the homework for this week is mostly going to target these block ciphers. Part of the assigned reading this week is the analysis, the cryptanalysis by Walt Whitfield Diffie and Martin Hellman. And the sort of like intended outcome of this week's reading is basically the original publication of the DES algorithm was like very historically controversial, and that like the NSA agreed to basically improve the algorithm privately with IBM, but the outcome of that was also reduced bit security for the algorithm, where Whitfield Diffie and Martin Hellman were arguing for 128 bits of security should be the sort of like standard for like what a real encryption algorithm should target. IBM originally targeted 64. The NSA said you should target 48, and they settled on 56 bits of security. And if you think about how easy it is to break 56 bits of security, even if there were like no like advances and like, you know, sophisticated attacks, 56 bits of security is kind of a joke. 80 bits of security is like kind of scary, but like might be secure. 56 bits is just a total joke. And Whit Diffie and Martin Hellman were basically criticizing this in the extra reading that I assigned for this week. So cool. Thanks for everyone who came this week. I want to highlight for anyone who trickled in late, there is a new forum post. And this is particularly useful for us to collect sort of feedback about how to think about future exercises. There's a section for talking about like you'd like to be in a more active time zone, or a more active study group with like sectioned off by time zones. And if you're feeling particularly challenged with Rust or anything else, this is a great place to sort of give that feedback, and we can sort of figure out ways to address that in the next week. So yeah, thank you everyone for coming, and thanks Chloe for co-hosting with me.
Yes, thank you everyone for coming out and bearing with our technical difficulties. Every week seems like we're having less of them, hopefully, knock on wood. And yeah, looking forward to the work we'll do over the week in the Discord. Already so many people using the forum in there, asking questions, supporting others. So it's really awesome to see. And yeah, thanks everyone again.
All right, cool. And I think we'll close out there. All right, bye everyone, and have a good week.